The theory that I have is that the ending, that what we see in the very ending is wrong. I think that our interpretation of what we're left with at the end of the movie is wrong. That Matthew has been, and I'm going to assume a lot. I'm going to assume that you've seen this movie. If anybody takes interest in this and wants me to redo it fully fleshed out with a lot more explanation, I will. But as far as I know, I can't find another video anywhere about this. So this is what I'm going to do. Um, we are left to understand or to believe that at the end, Matthew is assimilated, right? That Matthew's a pod person, and that Nancy approaches him and he gives Nancy up as a function of him being a pod person. And I don't believe that. I think that my theory is that Matthew was still human at the end of 1978's invasion of the body snatchers, but that he was in fact the real monster. And so the apparent resolution is that Nancy was assimilated, or I'm sorry, that Matthew was assimilated, identified Nancy as a human, undoubtedly spelling her doom, right? That Matthew spots that Nancy spots Matthew at the end of the movie. Matthew hesitates for just a couple seconds, then he points at her and does the pod person screech. And at first, I kind of took that at face value, and I thought, "Oh well, what a cool ending! That would be awful." And I just couldn't get out of my mind the way Nancy reacted. Maybe it was just really good acting. I don't know, but so I didn't really think about it, and boy, I just couldn't shake it. I couldn't get it out of my head. So I thought, well, what does she know? Like, what am I missing? So I just kind of isolated Nancy. I watched the movie again. I isolated Nancy as a character. I kind of tried to think about what she meant, who she was. Even went into like etymology of the names of the characters. That's when some things got really, really interesting. I'm not going to go super into that unless anybody wants me to. But this movie there's a whole deeper meta going on in this movie than what kind of the viewer first sees. It works on both levels. It works as a kind of a mindless thriller, but it works as if you want to watch it with that context. So which I did, and it makes it a much more rewardable experience in my opinion. Anyway, so Matthew's reaction to Nancy is the only proof given to us by the movie that Matthew has been assimilated. Right after showing us clips of him taking newspaper clippings and looking at Elizabeth not once, but twice. We'll get into that. There are some problems with this interpretation, with this description of the ending. There are a lot of problems with it. The very idea that pod people are assimilated copies teaches us, the movie itself teaches us, to not trust what is apparent. Don't trust our eyes that will deceive you. Don't trust people's voices. Don't trust anything about anything that you see. And so my entire case revolves around Nancy, right? And if at any point anybody can poke a hole in any of the things that I bring up about this, let me know, and I will admit defeat and that it's a stupid theory, and I'll just let it go. So let's talk about Nancy a little bit. Nancy is a human, okay, with such a highly attuned empathetic radar as to have the ability to accurately detect and perfectly mimic pod people. She tells Elizabeth and Matthew when she meets him in the elevator, when she meets him she avoided the elevator side of the building. She came up the stairs. She told them that they can be fooled. Okay? What differentiates pod people? A complete lack of emotions as humans think of them. Otherwise, pod people are virtual biological copies. In the stairwell scene, Nancy immediately and correctly identifies her human friends. She reacts first. She identifies them first. But first, she is poker faced. She's not letting anything through. Then she identifies accurately some sort of cues from them. Bam, she opens up. Oh my God, great to see you guys. I've lost Jack. When Matthew calls the cops and the operator already knows his name, And he says, "How do you know my name?" Why would he have asked the person on the phone that if he had already been assimilated? So we're going to make a couple different arguments all at once. She speaks up first and immediately and correctly identifies that they're all a part of it. She instantly kind of knows what's going on. As far as I know, now a hole that could be immediately poked in the story is if she came upon, if we saw her react inappropriately or in such a way that got her busted to someone who was a pod person, if there was an incident of that. As far as I know, however, in the entire movie, we never see Nancy face to face with someone who we know to be a pod person who was later outed as a pod person. I'm pretty sure about that. Uh, let's describe the ending again, okay? We'll go through like earlier. We said that at the end, Nancy spots Matthew. Nancy opposes Matthew. Matthew screams at her. That's the end. Okay. Well, let's reframe that. Let's describe it, but this time with some facts given to us from the movie itself. Nancy, who has proven to be able to accurately identify pod person from human, who survived all that time in the world full of pod people after the blackout, right? If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. After the blackout, all the way up until she happened upon Matthew. Her survival would have required her to be careful and have her spider senses on virtually 24/7. Nancy, who had ample time to follow Matthew and some cause to do so because they were close before the invasion, she would have had reason to suss him out beforehand, before this quote incidental running into, right, this happening upon. Suddenly, this person who had survived all this throws caution to the wind and hurls herself loudly and humanly, acts just like a human immediately upon seeing Matthew. If I'm not mistaken, I think even his back was turned. In the middle of the park, in public, in broad daylight. And in the scene, if you look at her, she doesn't look gross and disgusting. She looks well kept and clean. She's not just been living, or she's not just been surviving, she's been living. How many other people, so this kind of begs the question with Nancy, how many other people does she know and love that she would also have wanted to run to and greet? Probably people that she was way closer to and loved like family. But why Matthew? Matthew's the one person that made her weak enough to give up all of her, to set aside all of her knowledge and skill and ability, to throw all that out the window, throw caution to the wind, and go run to him. He's that important to her? There's no evidence of that in the movie whatsoever. So what other choice did Matthew have, right? Well, why did he do it then? Why didn't he just say, "Oh my God, Nancy, I see it's you. Wow, I see you're a human now too. Let's hide somewhere and talk." Because she had just done it in public. She had just outed him. So what did Matthew stand to lose? If Matthew was still a human, okay, if my theory holds out and he was still a human, then his life had been effectively reduced to being an emotional corpse after losing Elizabeth, to being a pod person, right? So what does he have left? What's the only thing that Matthew has left? It's Elizabeth. Even if she's in her pod person form, he still, in some sense, kind of has her, right? And he knows. So consider that after I've got my thing out of order here. Okay. Um, okay, so we have to talk about before we can. Well, I guess at the same time. So how did Matthew then? If this is true, if I'm right, if Matthew is in the pod people world and he is living, after he flees from Elizabeth, right? After he sees her, she is naked and going Matthew, and he goes on his rampage and he vanishes. Okay, how did he re-enter Elizabeth's life? How did he go back to life as normal? When he's standing there in the lab, he looks her right directly in her lab, in her pod person face, and pod Elizabeth doesn't suspect a thing. Well, he knew how because Nancy had told him. Nancy had shown him. He already had heard from Nancy how to live among them by showing no emotion. After all that he had been through, right? He lost Elizabeth the first time. Then he goes on this kind of violent outburst where he burns their their storage area down. And you think of all the violence and chaos and look at all his friends that he had lost. I mean, this guy was Matthew was probably on the verge of his humanity to begin with, and further down the road of becoming a soulless emotional monster that any pod could have ever made him. So it's not a stretch of the imagination after he had been through all that to just kind of die an emotional death, such that Elizabeth was the only thing he had left to cling to. And even if she was a pod person, after he is kind of out in the world, he says, okay, if she's all I've got, she's all I've got. And if my old life is all I've got, that's all I've got. So he's got newspaper clippings, seeing Elizabeth, and then pushing the elevator button for her, then fine. So what does that tell you? What does that tell us? That tells us that that's kind of his life now. And when Nancy, out in public, openly, loudly runs up to him and identifies him, outs him, he's got one choice. And you'll notice that he doesn't make that choice immediately. This is vital. He does not make the choice immediately. There is a delay. She runs up to him confidently. Matthew, Matthew, Matthew. He hesitates. That's where he's doing his calculations. The way she reacted wasn't, I've made a mistake. It was pure shock. Oh my God, she wasn't responding to the fact that he was a pod person. In my interpretation, she's responding to his betrayal of her. Look how pained. She doesn't run. She just collapses, I think. I'm pretty sure she just collapses at the very end. Could be wrong with that. Whatever the case is, her reaction isn't, she's genuinely shocked because she knows he's a human. That's it. That's the whole thing in the nutshell. A couple plot holes or thought holes, I guess, that I had thought about to that end, or that you could say stand against this theory, was the Nimoy scream, right? It was a Leonard Nimoy scream in the freezer. So Elizabeth bops him over the head, and Matthew kills the other guy with the dart to the back of the neck and chokes him out and darts him in the neck, and then they grab Nimoy, who is still alive, and they throw him in the freezer. Okay. Now, if you look at the timing of the scream, it happens right as Elizabeth and Matthew encounter Nancy in the stairwell, and right before she positively identifies them two and opens up and says, hey, I can't find Jack, whatever. So somebody could say then, well, why if then that was Matthew communicating to Nimoy in the fridge to let out a burst, to let out a scream, to let everybody know where he's at. That doesn't make any sense because he was in the room alone with Elizabeth just before that with Nimoy and the other guy. They would have no reason. He would have no reason to pretend at that point. Do her in and then carry on from there. Like there was no reason for him to do that at that point. And then later on, so after that, Elizabeth, who has been changed over, who's been altered, properly identifies him as having not been, and then he flees and goes on his big violent tirade. So that doesn't work. Which also shoots a hole in the head of the theory that Nancy misidentified Matthew as human for all the reasons we just said. Matthew was clearly human after all that happened, and I believe my theory is that he was human all the way to the very end of the story, even when he was doing the scream. The biggest piece of evidence that you're going to point to say that the scream says otherwise, the scream says he was a human, In this movie world, okay, in this world, it's very well established that they mimic humans precisely, down to everything. So that means in that world, that scream is possible with whatever their version of human anatomy is. Anybody can do that scream. I think in the real world, there's probably some people who get pretty close to it. Wouldn't surprise me, but even we know that it was layered pigs and pieces of metal being hammered, whatever, what all ever tricks of the trade were used to make that scream in particular. By the movie world logic, okay, we're talking in movie, they were a direct copy of humans. Therefore, humans could make that sound. So, my theory is Matthew was human at the end, but he had become such a monster that he was willing to betray the only other human possibly in the world to keep up his charade in the pod person matrix. Um, Let me know what you think. I think it's really compelling. I think it's a cool little theory. Let me know if I'm wrong, and thank you very much.